My name is Helena Norberg-Hodge, and I'm the director of Local Futures and also author of a book called Ancient Futures and the producer of a film called The Economies of Happiness. And I've been promoting what I've been calling decentralization or localization for almost 40 years. I had this amazing opportunity and in a way burden of arriving in Ladakh or Little Tibet just as it opened up to the outside Western economy. In fact, I used to think of it as being the West coming to Ladakh. In the last few decades, I realized that it's really more about a global economy coming to Ladakh. Really very little to do with the majority of Westerners who have not actually created and fomented that change. But I was able to learn to speak the language fluently. Right in the beginning, I was a linguist, and I came to know people who had the greatest and deepest sense of self-esteem of any people I had encountered. And I had traveled quite a lot and studied and lived in different cultures and spoke quite a lot of languages. But I had never encountered this open, joyful sort of radiance, really, a vitality. And so I just fell in love with these people. I'd come out as part of a film team. I was only going to be there for a few weeks. Then I decided to stay on to work on the language. And basically I've stayed on ever since, still going back and working, helping to set up local NGOs and local projects. But in the first few years as I worked on the language, I found that this incredible vitality so clearly had to do with a way of life in which people felt much more deeply connected and supported in an interdependent community fabric that was by its very nature collaborative, because the scale of things was such that people knew that they relied and depended on each other. And so inherently in these structures, the good of the individual and the good of the community was one and the same. I also came to realize that part of the incredible vitality and joy had to do with how more extended families and deeper community ties meant that every child was seen and heard and recognized as a unique individual in a way that we don't see in the Western world, and that this led to a profound sense of I'm okay the way I am, just the way I am, that played a big role in all this. Also, what was clear was that this sense of connection and communion with others was also communion with the animals and the plants, and that children grew up very much in relationship to these, with a lot of knowledge about how to use them and a whole range of skills, so that the multiple skills was another aspect, I think, to the way of life that led to such a positive sense of well-being. And then, of course, what I also saw was that they had been sustaining life in a very simple way. It was what we call a subsistence economy for literally thousands of years. And even though it wasn't perfect and in no way perfect, it was still vastly more sustainable than what happened when modern development and what we call growth, what we call progress, suddenly came into Ladakh. And it came in the form of what became, very clearly subsidized infrastructure, subsidized trade, subsidized transport. And this mega scale provided the opportunity for big businesses to deliver products locally for half the price of local products. So in a very short period, it destroyed the production and also the jobs, the work that people had, the workplaces that they'd had for generations. So I actually witnessed the creation of unemployment, the creation of a type of poverty that had not existed. it was nothing like the poverty that we see in most of the so-called third world, or even the poverty we see within the West. Because really, there had not been hunger, there had not been unemployment, nor had there been the type of pollution that these new developments brought. It was very clear that this new way of doing things was based on fossil fuels, and, as I say, heavily subsidized fossil fuels. So after a relatively short period, it was so obviously polluting, unsustainable, creating unemployment. So I started writing to the government, and I was able to start some projects to develop and demonstrate renewable, decentralized renewable energy as an alternative to this system. And that's what has developed and what we've been working on for many years. But I think the understanding of how this growth economy works, and that it's taken on a form which we actually tend to view as evolutionary. We have a tendency in our Western cultures not to see it as a consequence of planning. It's a planning for economic development that is transforming life worldwide, and that we are actually on this disastrous path where this planning is actually one that takes us further and further and further away from our profound human needs for community and connection to nature, but also that's taking us down a path where we are literally extinguishing species as we speak. We're extinguishing languages and cultures along with that. And now in the Western world, the tremendous insecurity that young people are having to face, where you have a combination of jobs, the jobs that are there, being concentrated in fewer and fewer mega cities. And in those mega cities, quite logically, the house prices escalate. And we're not just talking about Sydney or New York, we're talking about Beijing, Delhi, Mumbai. Around the world, the economic planning for growth, for progress, is leading to mega urbanization and mega unemployment and poverty, because people may try to stay on that treadmill, but there are very few winners, and even the winners are having to run so fast, it's like being on this treadmill, that depression, drug addiction, violence, all sorts of very clear psychological problems are a consequence of this. So it's so clear to those of us who've studied the direction of this dominant economy that we absolutely must change direction. And the wonderful thing is that there is so much evidence around the world, both from more traditional structures and cultures, but most importantly from the new development in what I broadly call localization, that's demonstrating that we can reduce our ecological footprint while increasing meaningful work opportunities, meaningful and enjoyable work opportunities. We can restore a form of democracy where we really do have some say over our own future, while actually increasing the productivity from the land, because small-scale, diversified production, especially in farming, forestry, and fishery, and all primary production, requires diversified, job-rich approaches, as opposed to vast monocultures using more and more fossil fuel technology. I quite consciously use the title Ancient Futures, plural, for my book, because what I was seeing was that there is so much that we can learn from ancient nature-based and community-based cultures, and that we need to learn about these fundamentals of a deeper connection to one another and to nature. And that as we take that into the future, at the moment, what I see happening is that it's happening unconsciously. I would argue that there's an innate need for deeper connections between people and nature. And so everywhere I look throughout the world, where urban industrial economic growth development has herded people into high-rise cities, often living in high-rise buildings with windows that don't open, and paradoxically living totally on top of each other, but not knowing each other, not able to be interdependent and cooperative, because those very structures that drove them in there are structures that are distant, anonymous government bureaucracies and big business. So we've ended up in this trap. But the good news is that quite instinctively there are countless projects that show that people long for this deeper connection with nature and with others, and in a myriad of ways they start moving in that direction as part of what we often consider progressive. So almost every activity you care to mention, medicine, architecture, religion, you have the word eco or alternative put in front of it. And whether it's called alternative or eco, it is about a better relationship with life, more natural ways of doing things, whether it's building materials or medicines or eco-theology, eco-literacy, ecological education, eco-architecture. These are very, very significant signals that we're talking about a deeply embedded evolutionary need to co-evolve with nature. And so that's what Ancient Futures is about. That doesn't mean that we can't add to the traditional systems a certain level of technology, some greater comfort, some lighting, better insulation, so there can be cooling in the summer and heating in the winter, more communication, even more transport. Doesn't have to cost us the earth, doesn't have to extinguish life as it is now. So that's the Ancient Futures path, which is also what we call localization. Well, I think it's very tragic that in the world today, modernity and development is so closely affiliated with technological change, and there's this sense that technology will change whatever. There's a way in which in the Western world there is a fatalism vis-a-vis what is actually painted as an evolutionary path of more and more technology, more and more growth, things getting bigger, faster, more competitive, more global all the time. When you study it around the world in different cultures, as I said, what you find is this quite intuitive response, which is not only characterized by this deeper connectedness to nature and to community, but there are other systemic characteristics that have to do with the longing to slow down. So you also see the rise of slow money, slow cities, slow food. There is a very clear need for a more human scale, for small is beautiful, and for rebuilding a fabric where human beings can, by shortening the distances between production and consumption, can have a better sense of their impact on the natural world and their impact on other people. Because in the global fast-paced system, what's happening is that I often talk about our arms have grown so long, we can't see what our hands are doing. So we have a system where it's really impossible as an individual consumer or as a CEO to be ethical. Partly because the very structures are so big that you can't see the impact of what you do. Partly because the scale of our economic footprint as a collective economic footprint demands reductionist specialization. And the reductionist specialization means that very humble scientists, technologists, whatever they might be, lawyers, can be working for a result which out there and on a bigger scale has a disastrous footprint, but they may be told, like geneticists working to create genetically modified food, that this is essential to feed the world. They have no experiential base to show them that this is absolutely absurd. Why would we need to patent seeds? Why would we need to create seeds that have terminated genes in them? In other words, seeds that cannot be regrown in the name of feeding the world. But as a scientist in the laboratory, I have known quite a few geneticists who were convinced that without more technology, we can't feed the world. Without more technology, we won't be able to deal with disease and illness. So I would argue that what we so urgently need is to step back, to have a bigger picture look at the role of technology and its link to over-reductionist knowledge, and above all, how that in turn is linked to mega-scale business interests. And those business interests are globalized multinational corporations and banks. As a system, they're interlinked. They're interlinked now in the money that is often created through derivatives and a way in which financial institutions have been deregulated to, in effect, create money through speculation. I mean, basically through thin air. And this money created of thin air is interlinked with a commercialization in academia, in the media, and that means in agricultural science, in pharmaceutical science, and it means that as part of this process, we are really on a very fast train taking us towards a techno-economic future that is disastrous. It is not about feeding us, it's not about maintaining health, it's not about building materials that can really house and support us in a sustainable way. It is, in effect, products that are linked to delivering the fastest profit possible to quite nice young men who are sitting somewhere in front of a computer gambling, speculating. And we have recently examples of how those activities involve fixing the interest rates to suit the needs of that gambling capital investment. We have examples of how in that system, the IMF has just come out with a report talking about how the fossil fuel industry is being subsidized to the tune of $10 million per minute. In the meanwhile, that exceeds what the health budget of all countries combined. Now, things are really beginning to happen, that these figures are coming out from places like the IMF, but what I think we're lacking is the big picture where we step back and we look at the interlinkages, the holistic, interdisciplinary analysis, to see that structurally the development of technology, and that includes, all the medicines and so on, as I was saying. So I think we need to step back and be able to look in an interdisciplinary way at how this global techno-economic juggernaut operates. If we do, we will see that the major trajectory which has allowed for-profit multinational banks and businesses to gain so much power, to become so big, has been a process of deregulatory treaties, trade treaties, that have been going on ever since after the Great Depression and the setting up of the Bretton Woods institutions. When the IMF and the World Bank were set up, they also set up something called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Now, a lot of people on the left who were extremely concerned already then about the power of multinational corporations didn't pay attention to these trade treaties, because in the media we'd hear countries are meeting to negotiate trade treaties. And of course, people want countries to agree, to collaborate. It was not spelled out that these trade treaties weren't really about relationships between countries. What they were about was the relationship between countries and multinational global banks and corporations, and that the process was one whereby there was almost a structural machine-like pressure from big business that in order to get bigger, they had to become more global. They had to pressure governments to lower any tariffs or standards, environmental standards or minimum wages, so that they could operate more globally and earn more profit. That's what these treaties have been about. Right now, we stand at this threshold where the latest trade treaties in the form of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, are taking the world in a direction where very explicitly countries are signing on to treaties that say explicitly that corporations and banks will be able to sue them if they do anything to impede their potential for making profit out of their countries. It is utterly insane. It is so anti-democratic. It is so against the interest of the governments, of the people, of the environment. And yet, because this process has been happening with very, very little understanding and awareness from either the grassroots or the governments, or I would say even inside the banks and corporations, I would say it's been a process on automatic pilot, aided and abetted by what we might call neoliberal think tanks that have had an absolute religious fervor about free trade and free markets, and they've done everything to push that agenda. So with this notion in many of the minds of those people has been that the only alternative is communism, and these top-heavy communist states were clearly disrespectful of human rights, they were anti-ecological, we don't want that, so this is the only way forward. Now we're standing at a point where it's becoming very clear that we have a type of multinational fascism, a top-down system that can be very, very similar to fascism. It's becoming incredibly intolerant of dissenting voices. It is so dominant, it is so monocultural that the closest thing to it is both fascism and communism. And the treaties that have these clauses, they're called ISDS clauses, investor-state dispute settlement clauses, where it's explicitly spelled out, we have the right to sue you. So countries are signing here, yes, please, go ahead and sue us. And already now a Swedish nuclear power company, I'm originally from Sweden, and we voted in a majority against nuclear power. But government said, okay, we'll wait, and we still have it. And we have powerful nuclear power companies like Waterfall, which is now suing Germany for 3.7 billion euros because Germany decided after Fukushima to phase out nuclear power. And this type of suing has been going on, but it's accelerating. So, as many people may know, Philip Morris has sued Australia for their cigarette packaging. But what I only found out the other day, having studied the impact of these trade treaties and this bullying on the part of big corporations, I didn't know that these cigarette companies have been going after tiny countries like Togo and saying, you let us market cigarettes to your 10-year-olds and make them look attractive, or we will sue you. Hundreds of millions. France has been sued for increasing its minimum wage. I mean, it really is something that I am convinced the majority of people would not want to see happen. But the key is, how can we get the information out? Because the media is also locked into They are giant corporations, and they are blindly. I really think it's almost like a machine. It's the best way to understand it. It's not about a few Rockefellers and a little group of men with fat cigars in a dark room. We're talking about this systemic interaction between over-specialized, narrow, too localized knowledge linked into a global, too large system of giant businesses that are simply too big. So let's not think of it as good guys and bad guys, and let's not believe for a minute that the way we'll change it is by getting some good guys to go into those large structures. Let's look systemically at how we can shift towards smaller structures with more holistic knowledge underpinnings, and that really is the localizing path. And part of that will require highlighting the already very rich fabric of experiments and examples at the local level, where supporting a more diversified, more adapted, locally adapted ways of doing things are showing that not only can we feed the world that way, but it's the only way that we're going to be able to feed the world. YASTAD, about YASTAD, the International Assessment, the International Assessment of Agricultural Science and Technology for Development. Big study commissioned by the World Bank and the UN. It involved something like 400 scientists and farmers from around the world, about 63 countries, I think 3-year study. When the results came out, it was buried, because the results were, as the head of the study said, Robert Watson was his name, if we allow the green revolution, industrial methods to continue, we'll be living on a planet no one wants to inhabit. It was a very clear message that this industrial, monocultural, large-scale production cannot feed the world, and that it is the major contributor both to climate change and to toxic pollution worldwide. Clear message that we need more diversity, we need more localized system, we need to support the small. More recently, an UNCTAD study, United Nations Commission on Trade and Development, came out with a study that was even stronger, that warned about the trade treaty direction and supported more localized, diversified systems. So, part of, from my point of view, the key thing we need is to spread awareness. So it's just, let's get the films out. We've got to find a way of reaching people. And the key thing is to both shed light on the current path that government and big business are encouraging, primarily through ignorance, because we have not delivered on a silver platter a clear, spelled out, systemic analysis that shows the insanity of what they're doing. Too many activists of many different kinds have somehow bought into the idea that of course we need growth, of course we need more technology, of course trade is wonderful, globalization is good. So we have not delivered a holistic analysis that have forced people to recognize what they're doing. And part and parcel of that is that we haven't shed enough light on the reality of both more traditional systems and the new myriad of initiatives that, broadly speaking, are about this more localized, nature-adapted way of doing things. Adaptation to nature means inevitably adaptation to diversity. Diversity is a fundamental principle of life. So one of the key characteristics of the choice is the large-scale global is taking us towards bigger and bigger monocultures. I think many people are aware of the monocultures in agriculture and forestry, but they're not really looking clearly enough at what it means to impose a human monoculture on the diversity of people around the world. They're not clear about how this is the major reason behind growing fundamentalism, and how it's responsible for not only a hatred towards the West, but actually it leads to local ethnic and religious friction and fear and fundamentalism. I think one of the things that's happening is that, particularly with the specter of climate change, there has been a sense that things are so urgent, we are threatened with extinction because of climate change, so therefore we've got to work with big business, and it's big business that can deliver the green technologies we need. And so there's been a big shift towards this idea of a type of new green growth and green corporate development. And again, I would argue that if we take a more holistic look at the relationships between the creation of money and these giant corporations, what we'll actually see is that it is impossible for them structurally, really even with the best of intentions. They are too big. We're told they're too big to fail. They're actually too big to continue existing because they are not compatible with the fundamental principles of life itself. They deliver monocultural, top-down, supposed solutions that are neither integrated into the infinite diversity that's within ecosystems, nor working within the social fabric that would allow people to actually use and spread ways of doing thing that can maintain the social fabric. And again, it has to do with diversity. It has to do with the fact that scale is so fundamental. I had a friend in Germany who used to call it Fehlerfreundlichkeit, which means failure-friendly technologies. We need to be supporting much smaller scale multitudes and a myriad of ways of doing things. We could do amazing things with a combination of using hydro, wind, solar on a scale that is adapted to different climates and ecosystems. We could then also use, in fact, wood is a wonderful material, certainly for building, but even for burning, if part of diversified, sustainable forestry. So we have to start examining this. One way to do is to actually look at people's lives and their real needs. Let's really look at the world and see what would it take for regions and countries to be able to feed themselves in a sustainable way. Let's support organizations like Via Campesina, which is one of the biggest social movements in the world. About 200 million small farmers and networks from across the world who've been trying for more than 20 years to raise awareness about the disastrous impact of the trade treaties. They've been asking for the right to have food sovereignty, to feed their own people in their own region first, not be pressured into monocultural production for export, which is actually pressuring farmers to grow for the giant middleman. The giant middlemen, in the form of huge multinational corporations and supermarket chains, are not able to treat farmers in a way that respects the absolute reality and necessity of diversity. These farmers are being pressured to grow standard-size apples without a single blemish. They have to fit the machinery, that is the harvesting machinery, the washing machinery, the supermarket shelf and the packaging. The end result is we burn tons of food every year. The end result is that the very research and development at university is now concerned about transportability and the looks of products, not the nutritional value, not the reality of diversity. So Via Campesina has been lobbying for the right to what they call food sovereignty, the right to produce food for their region, rather than being pressured to produce monoculture for the giant middleman. They're also lobbying to prevent the dumping of so-called cheap food in their region. The dumping of so-called cheap food is a consequence, again, of these trade treaties. That food is not actually cheap. It's costing us the earth. But it isn't just costing us the earth. It is literally only possible because of hidden subsidies. Our taxes end up paying for the infrastructure, for the R&D, to support giant corporations, to even support them to advertise abroad. We've had this absolute blind commitment to support global trade at all costs, and the idea is that that's helping to grow our economies. It's neither growing our economy nor the economy for the average Chinese person or the average person in Sweden or in India. It is actually growing the economy for, guess what, that group that we now tend to call the 1%. And in every single country of the world that I know of, the gap between rich and poor is widening in an utterly unsustainable and rapid way. We need to see this from a global point of view so that we actually start looking at the real government, the real structures that are pressuring our society in this direction. Because if we start looking just at left and right and thinking this individual here and that individual there, we're not going to get to a clarity. And one of the sad things is that in the last 30 years, with these series of trade treaties and corporations having more and more influence, remember again, not evil people, but an evil structure that is big and anti-life. These structures have so influenced our thinking that we've moved away from talking about what we can do collectively. In the 70s, when I started this work, most environmentalists and social activists were looking at how can we collectively, at the policy level and at the community level, change what we do. Through some very well-intentioned people, like Maurice Strong, whom I know personally, what was brought in was corporations to help the world shift towards sustainability and sustainable development. What of course emerged is that as these corporations got involved in the environmental movement, the last thing they would see was their own shadow. So suddenly a discussion about limits to growth, small is beautiful, the call from Rachel Carson for much more interdisciplinary, holistic knowledge suddenly disappeared. And now we were talking about biodiversity, about forestry, fishery. We were looking at symptoms. And what was very nicely packaged and sold was this idea of sustainable development. And so Rio was really the nadir for the whole environmental movement, where Westerners especially were told, if you try to tell people in the developing world that they should be more concerned about the environment than they are about development, you're an eco-fascist. Because of course there they need development. We don't need so much development in the West. As it happens, that message came at the same time that these giant multinational corporations were moving into the so-called third world to do most production. The industries were leaving, searching the globe for the cheapest labor. The cheapest labor was by definition in the so-called third world. So along came the message that over there, of course, they need development, and even when it comes to climate change, we shouldn't be asking them to reduce CO2 emissions because we're the ones who need to reduce the CO2 emissions. Well, as it happens, with big business producing virtually every shoe, every potato, every sock that we use, that's where the CO2 emissions needed to be emitted. And unfortunately, within the environmental movement, a lot of activists joined this idea of justice and came out with a message of contraction and convergence, that We should, of course, allow an increase in CO2 emissions in the so-called developing world, but not here. And instead of looking at the need for supporting, yes, after years of colonialism, there's no reason why middle-class Westerners shouldn't be supporting some of their people that they saw as impoverished after years of colonialism. But of course, what that should have meant would have been supporting decentralized renewable energy rather than the idea that it's fine to increase CO2 emissions. So now I think we're at this stage where the global market cannot deliver ethical products. I mean, you cannot, within the current configuration of these subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, the deregulated global activity, to think that any market solution is going to work is wrong. We need to change the rules of the market. So we need to re-regulate global trade and finance while we deregulate local trade and finance. Local trade and finance are overregulated and regulated in a way that is inappropriate and that is not adapted to localities. Doesn't mean that we don't need regulations at the local level, because we need binding global regulations, binding collaborations between countries to protect the environment, to protect human rights. But under that umbrella, we need to be developing the diversified, localized solutions that will look different from place to place. So this current green consumerism, ethical corporations, carbon trading, even divestment within the current deregulated, criminally imbalanced global framework cannot deliver the solutions that people want. I could use the term economics of happiness to basically describe the economics of localization. And that's because the economics of localization are the economic structures that help to rebuild a sense of interdependence with other people and with the natural world around us. I've witnessed not only how traditional cultures like in Bhutan and Ladakh, how that sense of interdependence with the animals, with the plants, with the environment around you and with people around you was the foundation for much happier, healthier identities. Identities that were actually, because of security, so much more tolerant of diversity and difference. And I saw what happened when people were robbed of that ability to feel connected to their community, when suddenly young children were fooled into believing that in order to have the love and respect of their peer group, they needed to have the latest running shoes, and they needed, as girls, to look like blonde Barbie dolls, and they needed to be something that was being presented in this monocultural consumer media culture. And nobody can live up to those images of perfection. So I've seen how being shaped by distant economic forces and imagery is so soul-destroying, so destructive of healthy identity. And I've seen that within the world, within the center of the Western world, the most extreme problems that come from such alienation, drug addiction, alcoholism, sex addiction, eating disorders, violent behavior, depression. The key therapies that really work are therapies that rebuild a sense of community, connection to others, and the really successful ones also include a sense of spiritual connectedness to the cosmos, to nature. So there are projects where absolutely violent juvenile delinquents whose whole lives have been anger and abuse and angry young men taken out into nature with guidance, aided to open up and connect to others, to form sense of community and shared problems as well as support and connections to nature. Also learning a few skills where they see they can actually be more productive and learn to do things that are new to them and that are meaningful. Within a matter of weeks, people can be transformed with that. Now, the heartbreak for me is that this type of therapy could be occurring everywhere, but we're locked into this global economic system. Not only have we, deregulated the corporations, but as part and parcel of that, we're ending up subsidizing the use of technology to replace people. So in almost every activity, the human element has become too expensive for us. We cannot afford to have this type of care for the majority. It becomes an elitist thing. Equally absurd in a planet, in a world where you have a huge problem with unemployment and a huge problem with energy consumption and the pollution that comes from it. To continue down this path now with these trade treaties is just absolute madness. But part of that current system is that everywhere you go around the world, you'll find that a local product will cost more than something from the other side of the world. Now that is a perfect example of how completely manipulated and imbalanced the economy is, supporting and subsidizing more energy, technology, and large-scale global trade, making us too expensive for ourselves, and making our local products and our natural products too expensive for ourselves. Then in the meanwhile, we have corporate think tanks that actively put out the message that, well, the local and the more labor-intensive, it's all elitist. That type of therapy is elitist because it costs money. A healthy, natural, organic apple, that's elitist because look, Woolies and Walmart can deliver an apple for half the price, and that's because we care about people. So urgent need for rethink from the bigger perspective. The silver lining to consuming less is actually consuming more of what we really want and what we really long for. And that includes, handmade artisan products that, most people treasure much more than some mass-produced product. It includes more time to breathe and to sing together, to dance together, to make things together. There's a whole universe of things out there that we could do right now without money, but it requires the insight and the courage to connect to others and to form groups where we can change the I to a we. So there's so much that we can do right now without spending any money to greatly enrich our lives. And let's not be fooled by this idea that we have so much choice in the modern economy and that our lives would be so limited if we were to choose a different path. We have not even begun to explore the potential for more diversified, localized ways of doing things, because it's never been a priority. Traditional nature-based cultures worked vastly less than we do, and they worked enough to have clothing, shelter, and their needs met, but perhaps not at the standard or the level that we would want. There has never been, to my knowledge, any group in the world, any regional or national size, that actually focused on how can we diversify the economy? How can we experiment with the greatest diversity of plants and see what can be adapted in this ecosystem? How can we use local materials to the greatest potential and use, with lots of people helping to build the houses, to grow the food, to make the clothing? We just are stuck in this idea that mass production is somehow more efficient, more egalitarian, and the idea that we're so much happier if we don't have to do anything. Now, another thing that is a clear source of depression is a lack of mobility and basically not getting enough exercise, a lack of creativity, of actually being able to use our hands and make things. And so again, a lot of the meaningful therapies that really work actually involve people in these products, in projects where they can start making things with their own hands. They also are very clearly linked to encouraging exercise as a way of countering depression. There are all kinds of studies now that show it's a major ingredient in reducing depression. So there is a wealth of possibilities. Maybe one of the most important ones to stress is that the truth is that the current growth is depriving us of more and more time to do what we want. We are enslaved, we're trapped in a system that's making us run faster and faster to compete more and more with our neighbors and friends for a smaller pool of jobs. It is so tragic that many people subconsciously believe, well, there's so many people in the world, and so therefore obviously we all have to scramble for scarce jobs. It's completely the opposite of the truth. On a crowded planet, we have more work than ever that's needed. Why on earth, on a crowded planet, would we have fewer teachers to students or fewer nurses to ill people? Only because of economic policies that allow this concentration and technologization. So there is a way in which, even if people choose a more industrialized path, even if the artisan and making more with their own hands doesn't appeal to people, even if they want to choose a more industrialized development path, there is a huge amount to be gained by supporting a direction where we take the power away from giant multinational corporations, create a structure whereby we democratically decide the rules for business. Doesn't mean government runs business. It means that society determines that it's more efficient to use resources more carefully and employ more people. We want more jobs, we want less pollution. There is a way in which this, simply by focusing on the trade treaties and re-regulating trade and finance, we can start pulling that power back. And in the meanwhile, we really need to study, we need to spread the word about the localization initiatives that are showing that we can produce more food per acre of land if we diversify and have job-rich production and shorter distances. There's a structural link between shorter distances between production and consumption and diversity on the farm. Structural connection between the long distances and monoculture. And remember, monoculture means also standard size apples, standard size potatoes. It goes completely against nature. So when you start shortening the distances, and urban consumers in many cases start these projects, and when they set up new farmers markets, and suddenly the farmer finds that people are happy to buy potatoes, even if they're many different sizes, and even if they have a few specks on them, they actually tend to feel that if they have a few specks on them, they probably haven't been sprayed so much, and they prefer not to have so many pesticides. So there's this win-win strategy where the diversification and the more direct relationship between producers and consumers leads to higher productivity, not just more diversity agricultural biodiversity, but as the farming diversifies, you actually create more niches for wildlife. So you're actually shrinking the ecological footprint on many different dimensions. You're shortening distances, you need less packaging, so less plastic, far more possible to actually reuse containers, and that's another thing that's starting to happen. You're in the process starting to rebuild that interdependence between people, which we have seen in many communities reduce prejudice between right and left, between different ethnic groups, different religious groups. And by, of course, restoring the community or getting back to that sense of well-being and economics of happiness, you're really answering what is a deep human need, because that's how we evolved. It's coming back onto a track that would allow life to continue evolving, that would allow for real progress. The other path is suicidal. I mean, we are going to soon get to the point where localize or die, basically, because we cannot continue extinguishing species, cannot continue creating frustration, fundamentalism, terror. We cannot continue so blatantly destroying any form of democracy. Things are going to change, and I think we'll see, that people are waking up very, very rapidly to the benefits of localization. I think the alternative that I envision is, first of all, is a direction. So it's not about saying, okay, you're going to eat local. In many parts of the world, people will be eating oil or tobacco, because we're talking about a process, understanding how this monocultural emphasis on monoculture for export is the enemy, and diversification for local needs is part of the rebalancing. It's not about eliminating trade, and there's no absolute about the distances, but we need to start that journey. And equally, it's not about some kind of local purity right now. If you're not only eating local, if you're not only buying local products, let's remember that we've got to shift those subsidies, because for many people, the local and the organic and the healthy is not affordable. So we need to make the honest, real economy such that everywhere in the world, an apple that's traveled 1 mile is going to cost less than an apple that's traveled 10,000 miles. Right now it's the opposite because of the manipulation that subsidizes the Walmarts and the Woolies. So how to get from here to there, first requires awareness campaigns. So I see education as activism, as one of the most important things. And there, I think that a lot of people have lost interest in politics. And I think it's because they weren't actually looking at the real government, the de facto government, by interlinked corporations and banks. So they were looking at this, basically a type of theater between left and right. And they've become so disillusioned now that many people have said, well, forget about politics, let's just turn to the local and do what we can in the local area. But I think that we'll see that change would come about much faster if we started identifying that real economic system that is the real government behind the scenes, and started articulating clearly why it is the main reason behind global warming, the main reason behind violence, unemployment, loss of democracy, and identifying very clearly that these trade treaties need to be halted, and then starting a process of bringing the power back. Now that process would so clearly need to involve the community, local government, non-profit, social environmental movements as very much part of that discussion. So for me, change will come about, as part of this whole education as activism for me, is to first of all realize that We very much disempower ourselves when we go the sort of conventional path. So first of all, just looking at these individual political parties and individuals has not been productive. Another way we disempower ourselves is to say, oh, to change the system, we have to reach these people who are just enamored of McDonald's and television and who are just, these blind consumers, and we can't change them. First of all, I think they're not as stupid as we make them to be, but I think that if instead we thought, how about looking at all those people who are still giving of their time as volunteers, or who are even funded to solve problems, whether it's the churches, whether it's all those individuals who are trying to protect the whales and the dolphins and the forest and the water and the fighting GMOs, fighting nuclear power, gas fracking. All those people who are doing something to reduce poverty, who are concerned about the treatment of immigrants, who are concerned about poverty in the so-called third world. We would be amazed to see how much effort, voluntary effort, but also how much money goes into essentially making the world a better place. If we could build on something that's already starting now to happen, which is that people are beginning to link hands and say, we need to change the economic system, the techno-economic system. It's not a narrow thing. It's not just about banking, which we also have to look at. It's not just about one aspect of it, but as a system. So that is beginning to happen. People are coming together from the social, from the ecological, from the spiritual movements, concerned about consciousness and well-being and happiness. And that's where I believe the change is beginning to happen, the change in thinking. And I think it will lead to very positive change. In the meanwhile, there are also people who have said, well, the system will crash anyway, so let's just get on with doing things at the local level. I think that's unfortunate. I think we're missing an opportunity, because these trade treaties with their clauses to allow corporations to sue governments are just so mad that we're really missing out on an incredible invitation to actually do something about that big system. So I think, and if we don't, what's really worrying is that the global economy has become so artificial. People, even conventional economists, have talked about how in 2008 it was so obvious that the people who actually work and produce things, they were thinking particularly of industrial production, but are being marginalized and earning almost nothing, whereas a few bankers that speculate earn money, literally $1 million bonuses, etc. So the injustice of that and the senselessness of that has become apparent. What I think we need to realize is that these trade treaties are taking that even further. And that means that we're allowing this imaginary economy that is not based on production and is not based on answering either people's needs or nature's needs, but that collectively, because of the huge amounts of money that go into the war machine, that go into now mega technologies. So again, talking about technology, we need to distinguish between mega technologies as technological systems versus tools and technologies that can be really helpful. And these mega technologies include now synthetic biology, geoengineering. And so as these speculative dollars by the trillion, even some estimate quadrillion, pour into and push mega technologies, mega urbanization, jobs concentrated in fewer and fewer centers, and people just pouring in there to fight for a few jobs, and the housing prices going up. That system could continue maybe for decades if we allow it to. So let's raise our voices about that while we do everything we can to start right now the path that builds the systemic alternatives that are based on community and adaptation to natural systems, to ecosystems and climates, and that really nourish and cherish diversity. There are so many of them, and they're so inspiring, and we need to try to collect them and make them more visible. And we've got to get across the idea that many small can be far more productive and far more powerful than one big. So, just like 100 farms of 10 acres each could produce much more than one giant farm with monoculture. In the same way, a chain of smaller businesses, as we now have in the ballet alliances and so on, Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, and many of the smaller scale initiatives that also involve some local funding for local initiatives. So they're making more visible this myriad of examples that demonstrate that we can have, at one and the same time, greater productivity, more meaningful work, more community, more real democracy, because we have more real power over our lives. And there are these countless examples that are demonstrating it. So we need to make those visible and show that they are the economics of happiness. And the economics of happiness is the economics of localization. And another way to talk about the happiness is to call it the economics of human as well as ecological well-being. I do think that it's really constructive to see that what we need, from my point of view, is what I call big picture activism. And so that would involve much more effort into spreading message, information, vision as an activism. So it's perhaps better sometimes, rather than trying to set up a new eco-village or a new permaculture garden or a new farmers market or a new local finance scheme, to spend some time identifying and disseminating information about those that exist. It's been remarkable to see that even in places like Totnes, a majority of people didn't even know about transition towns. Still, many people don't know about it. Portland, Oregon, which is one of the localization capitals of the world, we just had a conference there, and it's so clear there are so many amazing initiatives there, even involving some government policy change, like allowing composting loos in the town, allowing people to keep chickens in the town again, changing regulations around groundwater treatment towards more ecological methods. So, but still, the majority of people there don't know about this very significant systemic shift towards localizing. So I think there's this huge need to get the big picture out, and that big picture needs to include what we call resistance as well as renewal. So it is, I think, unfortunate that you have some people who will have spent a lot of time critiquing, often I feel in too narrow a way. It wasn't a systemic, interdisciplinary critique of the system. And that means it can often be focused on just one corporation or on certain individuals or on one aspect. And that doesn't really help us, I think, to see clearly how the systemic shift can be so beneficial. And by not being holistic, what we end up doing is fueling what the proponents of this blind free market ideology propose. And that is, we end up fragmenting ourselves, because we end up, by arguing for green, we alienate people who have not seen that the reason the green products are more expensive is because their taxes are subsidizing them. And so we often, but without bringing together a bigger picture of how both people and the environment are suffering, we end up feeding right into the system. So it's so important that we put out a more holistic message that can lead to the sort of collaboration that's beginning to happen between environmentalists and social activists coming together for a new system, for a new economy. Equally, if we only critique the current system, that's not quite enough either, because we need to make it very clear that there is another system. And the beauty of localization is that a key element is the respect for diversity. So in a sense, we're talking about a system that would end all systems, in the sense that the inherent in both communism, fascism, corporate capitalism is top-down large structures that don't respect diversity. Now we're looking at a way that is truly more empowering, and I think in promoting that, we also need to deal with what we call certain sticky issues, because there's been huge propaganda that has made people believe that localizing means going back to these small, dead towns where, nothing happens and it's boring and it's just dead. So there's, again, a huge amount of educational work that's needed to show that, sure, most local towns, most small farmers have been marginalized. In many cases, we're talking about hundreds of years. Marginalized, drained, as everything has been pulled into the city, into this top-down system. What's been left is outposts of marginalization. And so for many young people, obviously, it's so much more exciting to go to the heart of the big city, because that's where the action is. That's where the political power is. That's where the culture is centralized. And what we have to show there is what happens in smaller towns, where people actually start bringing the power back and actually start building things that bring the creativity, the culture, and even the political, and very importantly, the economic power back. There we're talking about hotbeds that are thriving and rich and very exciting. But at the moment, they're not, the average small town or the average outpost, which, as I say, can often feel very marginal and very dead. In the old days, it was just so exciting, even in the tiniest village. And it was so clear in retrospect that it had so much to do with the fact that people in themselves felt so vital and so strong. There was this rich sense of humor. They had theater, the singing, the dancing, the music, building beautiful houses. There was this pride in their food. It was so vital and so exciting. And then as these developments drew people into the capital, made people feel that they were backward, primitive, and nobody, it's like the light goes out. The light goes out of people's eyes, and very, very clearly what happens is, as you destroy both self-esteem and self-reliance, you're creating a recipe for intolerance, for violence. I mean, it happened in both of those places, both Bhutan and Ladakh, that Buddhists and Muslims in Ladakh, Hindus and Buddhists in Bhutan started literally killing each other. But it's this death of self-respect and self-reliance that then makes those places dead and drained of life. But as I say, I've seen, when we really see what the formula is for restoring self-esteem and self-reliance, which has to do with changing the I to a we. We've got to connect with others, and we've got to connect, with nature. Then you can see how it can be reversed. And I said also, with the most entrenched addictions and, human behavior that you would think is impossible to change, that this recipe works.